All right, this is Debate on behalf of Electronics, and in this video, we'll be talking about trade imbalances and fiscal policies. All right, now, whenever there is a trade imbalance, okay, let's say the imports are more than exports, okay, it may be a matter of time before the country heads towards a large deficit. The government heads towards a large trade deficit, okay, as well as um, a large budget deficit. Okay, now this budget deficit will eventually lead to a recession if the government spending and borrowing goes up, keeps going up. All right, as a result of which, okay, let's assume that you have a trade imbalance. And this trade imbalance means that imports are more than exports. Okay, so your imports are more than exports. And because imports are more than exports, okay, what's going to end up happening is, okay, you have an inflow of financial capital. So inflow of financial capital. Well, first of all, this leads to a trade deficit. This is a trade deficit. All right, and you also have the inflow of financial capital because of the currency exchange rates. Okay, so let's say the trade deficit as well as a budget deficit um, keeps having the government borrow and spend more money, which eventually leads to a devaluation of the currency as the purchasing power goes up because of an inflation. Okay, what's going to end up happening is foreign investors will invest their capital. They will invest in banks to earn interest rates. Okay, to earn interest from high interest rates. Okay, as a result of which you have an inflow of financial capital. Okay, however, the inflow of financial capital in a country is good as long as it funds all the components of a GDP. Okay, we've talked about GDP growth in the past, okay, such as personal consumption. You have private or capital investment by private firms, okay, so on and so forth. So if it does not increase personal consumption, if the banks are not able to lend money out to consumers, to businesses for capital investment, okay, we don't have a growth of the economy in general. So the economy is not expanding, the economy is not growing. Okay, the GDP is not growing. As a result of which, if you have an inflow of financial capital, okay, the GDP is not growing. If the financial capital is not long term, okay, capital is not long term, is not long term. Okay, so the investors are not investing their money for a long term, as a result of which, okay, this is not the kind of money you want to use to give out loans, right? Because if the investors decide to borrow and withdraw their money right away, let's say within a year or two, the banks do not have money. All right, which means if the banks give out loans, they will be in deficit. Okay, they will risk bankruptcy and insolvency. All right, as the foreign investors withdraw their money. Okay, so if the GDP is not growing, okay, and let's say the inflow of financial capital is not helping the capital investments. Okay, if it's not helping the capital investments, if it doesn't help the capital investments, what's going to end up happening is, okay, you will have, okay, a period of GDP or economic contraction. Okay, so you have an economic contraction, economic contraction. And because of this economic contraction, okay, what's going to end up happening is, okay, you will have a depression as recession escalates, a depression from a bank run. Okay, and because of that recession, the foreign investors withdraw their money. And to solve this problem, okay, you have fiscal policies such as tax cuts and tax increase. So fiscal policies. So we've talked about fiscal policies and automatic stabilizers along with discretionary fiscal policies back in the past. Your automatic stabilizers include employment insurance, so on and so forth, food stamps. Okay, but here we're talking about tax cuts and tax increase. So when it comes to tax cuts and tax increase, okay, what's going to end up happening is when the governments decide to reduce their taxes, it will stimulate growth. It will stimulate growth. Okay, as businesses, okay, businesses decide to spend more, businesses borrow and spend more. And when businesses within a nation borrow and spend more, there's less money for financial capital for foreign investors. Okay, so the inflow of financial capital is relatively less. And that is in an economy that is trying to recover from, let's say, a recession. Okay, so when you have a recession and you have an inflow of financial capital, there's a risk of bankruptcy, there's a risk of insolvency, as a result of which the recession might lead to a depression. However, if the government uses a fiscal policy to reduce its taxes and allow the domestic businesses to lend more money and invest in capital such as equipment, land, machinery, so on and so forth, it will increase the GDP and get the country out of recession. Okay. The financial capital itself will not get the country out of recession because the financial capital does not impact your GDP. The financial capital pumps money into the system. It may even cause inflation if there is no production. Okay. If this money is not being used for capital investment, you will have inflation. All right. So without production, there is no GDP growth. All right. So here, businesses borrow and spend because of a tax reduction. And this will reduce, okay, the inflow of financial capital during a recession. Inflow or dependence on the inflow of financial capital during a recession. So when the investors decide to withdraw their money, okay, the banks will still have enough money that they lent out to firms, private firms within the country for capital investment. Okay, so their access reserves, okay, the banks will still be making money from the financial instruments as well as the money that they lent out to businesses for capital investments. Okay, so the banks do not run the risk of going bankrupt anytime soon. All right, so this will be financial capital. All right, so that would be it for this video. On behalf of Electronics, this is Obey. Have yourself a great day.